Okay, so it is a pleasure for me to present the next speaker, Dr. Laurence Boone, the Chief Economist of the OECD. Laurence holds an MA with a specialization in econometrics at the University of Reading and a PhD from the LSE. She began the career at Merrill Lynch Asset Management. She was a researcher at France Economic Research Institute. She also co-authored a book on exchange rates. That it's not the topic that we're going to talk today. Between 2014 and 2016, she was special advisor for multilateral and European economic and financial affairs. And at the OECD, in her term, she will supervise the contributions of the economics to the new approaches and economic challenges, including the topic we're going to talk today, inclusive growth initiatives, and also represent the OECD together with the Secretary General at the IMF and with the OECD Sherpa in the G7 and G20 meetings. And especially, I would like to thank you, given that you are at the beginning of your term and you accepted to come here. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think you're being far too kind with me for an introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored, especially that you trust me so shortly after I've been appointed to participate in the conference, and I'm very honored to be there in the honor of the Governor Carney's flag, who is such a strong advocate of reducing inequality and promoting inclusive growth, which, as you know, is a topic that we pay a lot of attention to at the OECD. So I've been very impressed by the presentation this morning, and what I will show you is much more work in progress than the paper that we have gone through this morning. But I think 10 years after the crisis, or during the 10 years that followed the crisis, inequality and inclusive growth has become much more of a concern for us. Inequality was sort of tolerable when economic growth was very buoyant, but now that it's lower, it may have contributed to the rise of nationalism, protectionism, and rejections of reforms, and that may spur growth. So inequality is a concern for fairness itself, but we think that it is also a concern for growth and with self-reinforcing trends. There are many reasons why inequality may harm economic growth, especially when it reflects inequality of opportunities. It deprives the poor of the ability to stay healthy and invest in human capital. It prevents them from engaging in productive activities, especially when they cannot access finance. This limitation may in turn slow social mobility, reduce incentive to work, and subsequently contribute to lower growth. And it may also generate political and social instability, which reduces investment and may impede the social consensus that is required to adjust to shock. It's quite tempting to think that if policymakers could simply get growth going, inequality could take care of itself. But I think the experience of the past 3 decades have shown us that this is a dangerous gamble. Slow and fragile growth and inequality seems to be 2 sides of the same coin. And the healthy path of growth can only be sustained if it benefits all. So this is why many institutions, and that includes the OECD, have tried to develop an analytical framework for inclusive growth and especially paid attention to the impact of reform on income distribution. While there is a consensus that structural reforms can increase growth, there is also evidence that certain structural reform could exacerbate inequality. And besides, I think it's quite undeniable that some reform creates winners and losers, and that the losers may make the implementation of reform politically difficult. Empirically, it has been difficult to prove that the link between inequality and growth because of analytical limitation and because causality is hard to establish. Also, econometrics not always very conclusive. So the framework that I will present to you today is really work in progress. And the way we have addressed it is twofold. The first one is to extend the availability of indicators that measure inclusion. We want to be able to have many of them, and this relates to one of the discussions I had with with Adi and Michel yesterday evening. The more diverse the set of indicators, the easier or the more help we'll get to identify the right policies. And the second leg of this framework is we want it to be evidence-based. A lot of policymakers will talk about policy evidence, but we want to design policy that rely on a strong econometric analysis and for which we have as much evidence as possible. And in this work, I will show you how we are in the process of identifying how structural reforms impact growth, but also what their impact is on the income distribution. And this should allow us to actually present a set of policy options to policymakers when they can identify the right policy package to boost growth, and also when necessary to accompany them with other policy to correct for inequality, or at least to be able to assess the inequality that it's creating. So let me start with a few facts. I think you all know them, but it's always good to recall that over the past decade, most people in many OECD countries have seen little or no income growth at all. Across the OECD, the median income has grown less than 2% per year, and in some countries it has even declined. And in addition, when we look at the dispersion of disposable income, so after taxes and transfer, it has been on the rise not only over the past 10 years, but rather the past 30 years in most OECD countries. And the situation within this, the situation of low-income earners, which you can see on the left side of the distribution, has not improved at all. When we focus on the bottom of the distribution, we can see that declining overall inequality did not lift or did not come from higher relative income of poor households everywhere. And inequality increased in the bottom of the income distribution across most OECD countries. If you look at the example, for example, of Norway and Hungary, the income share of the bottom 20% decreased, even so overall inequality decreased. And I'm not showing it here, but when we look at wealth inequality, it's also much higher than income inequality and much more widely dispersed across OECD countries, which tend to perpetuate overall inequality. So there are several factors behind this evolution, and I will briefly describe them in turn. First, the evolution of wage and demand for skills tend to push inequality. But also there has been declining redistribution. So not only we have inequality of wages, but we also have inequality ex post after redistribution. And the way the underlying factors of this suggest that this trend will continue. So wage first. As you know, you're all economists here, wage growth depends strongly on productivity growth. And what this chart helps to show is that there has been a widening gap between the super productive firm, what we call the superstar firm, or firms at the technology frontier, and other firms which are lagging behind. And this divide and this widening divide between the firms which are able to seize all the benefits of technology and digitalization has created a widening divide between the wages of workers working for those firms and the workers working for the laggards firms. And that is what you can see on the right-hand side. And what's more, in the next economic outlook, which we will publish in November, we also show that within the superstar frontier firms, where productivity growth is really high, usually wage growth is much lower than productivity growth. So there is a decoupling of productivity growth and wage growth. So we have widening wage inequality, which are both within firms and across firms. And because this relates to the ability of sizing the benefit of digitalization, we think that it's quite likely to continue in the absence of policy reforms. There are an increasing number of papers, and some of you may recall the Jackson Hole discussion, which shows that part of the ability of these firms actually to grow faster than the others is because of the lack of competition and the creation of monopsony on the product market. So that's the first thing I wanted to highlight. In the absence of a change of competition and the preservation of monopsony power, we're going to see widening divide between workers who work for productivity firms and the others. The second thing is when you combine digitalization and trade, you can see that there is a huge polarization of the labor market, and it proceeds in 3 steps. First, globalization increased competition for talent, and their wages are pushed higher. Their work cannot be automatized. They are sought for by many multinational firms, so the demand for high-skilled workers and the associated compensation go up. Second thing is those jobs which are very routine-oriented, which have mechanistic tasks, they tend to suffer the most for globalization because they can be offshored for much cheaper price, or they can be replaced by machine. And lastly, the lower part of the distribution, I think, is composed of people providing services at home, not exposed to trade, but they're usually low-skilled services and they're not very well compensated for. And also there's a huge difference between the world today and what we saw with the financial sector in the run-up to the crisis. In the run-up to the crisis, when the financial sector was paying higher wage throughout the scale of skills. So the CEO of a bank was paid higher than the CEO of a manufacturing firm, but the secretary, the cleaning person were also paid higher. Today, what we are seeing is an offshoring of these jobs to service company, and they don't benefit at all from the same compensation package, the same training, the same healthcare that they had when they were included within those firms. So what we have at the end of the day is still demand for low-skilled work, but not well compensated, an offshoring of middle-skilled jobs, and higher remuneration for top-skilled jobs. And that's obviously creating large divergence and inequality for workers. So that could perhaps be okay if at the same time we had a redistributive system across the OECD that was actually compensating for those gaps. But what this chart highlights is that the change in redistribution has also worked in the direction of spurring this widening inequalities. What we represent here is the change in the redistribution for the working age population since the mid-90s. And you can see that nearly across all countries, except the Czech Republic, redistribution has actually declined throughout OECD countries. In part, this is due to the competition for talent that I was describing earlier, where what we have seen is that what has tended to be taxed is the low mobile base, and that's usually the middle and lower skill workers, whereas taxes on higher skill people have tended to decline so as to be able to compete on a global basis. But overall, the share of revenue available for redistribution has declined, and that has generated this trend. So wage widening, skills widening, less redistribution, and I think the last thing we want to look at is how mobile the society is. And here as well, what you can see is it's a common phenomenon across OECD countries that social mobility has stalled. There is a statistic that I find very striking is if your parents had a second degree, then you have 65% of chance to get an education with a second degree of higher. If they were below if they were below a second degree, then your chances of getting to a second degree is only 15%. And that means that these social inequality are being perpetuated through generation. And the last thing in this brief description is all this evidence of lower wages, widening gaps across skills of people, stalling social mobility is obviously generating a mistrust in government. And throughout the OECD country, we have observed that the confidence in political institutions or government precisely has declined since 2005-2007. And that's important for an economist because it means that reforms are going to be more difficult to implement because there will be a lot more mistrust and opposition for people to actually put in place the reform agenda that is needed both to increase growth and reduce these inequalities. So to sum up, inequalities are persistent, social mobility has stalled, redistribution has decreased, and the widening gap between high-skilled, high-earning workers and the others has opened. And more than that, it looks set to persist with the increasing digitalization. So in response to this dynamic, we have argued that growth needs to be more inclusive and that policies need to focus ex ante on their associated redistribution effect. So we all know that structural reforms create losers and winners, but it's also the case that the higher skilled part of the population is usually more able to grasp the opportunities which are offered by reforms, which is an additional reason why we should pay attention to what's happening to the rest of the population. So for years or decades, the OECD has very much focused on structural reform that boost growth without paying much attention to inequality or inclusion. And there's this, since 2005, the OECD published this Going for Growth publication that was really focusing on the priorities to increase productivity growth. Well, since 2017, now we're looking at the inclusive side of growth and the impact that the reform may have on inclusion. So here you have the inclusive growth dashboard, which I was mentioning at the beginning of the discussion, where we try to expand the list of indicators that is providing evidence of how inclusive the society may be. So we have an income dimension, which you're very familiar with, but we're also including in the analysis non-income dimension, and that will be people who are vulnerable to shock to the labor market. It will be looking at the elderly, the youth, and the female employment gap, the foreign-born unemployment gap. We look at health outcome and inequalities. We also obviously focus on the equality of opportunities, and you've been kind enough to mention PISA and PIAC in your research, which is something that really underpin as well our work on this. Now, I would be lying if I was telling you that we have a perfectly econometrically robust quantitative framework for all these indicators, and I'm sure none of you would believe me, so I won't pretend that. But we use these indicators, and let me go back to this, to match it with the type of policies and look at it across countries so that we have some benchmark from peer reviews. And from them, we extract what we think are the key areas where reform should take place. And we do that in interaction with the country desk, because as I think the research you showed this morning, whether on housing or on earned income tax credit, the success of a policy depends very much on the culture, the history, the setup of the society. So there is an element of qualitative, what we call experts. I will manage to stop doing this. Expert judgment that is into this, this work. But for some of it, we also have some quantitative job. The type of recommendation we provide can be divided into three broad areas. firms, and that has to do with product market regulation, the tax system, the legal, the physical infrastructure. Skills, that's where we use the PIAC and PISA analysis. And one of the things that the OECD has been very vocal about is early child care, and I will come back to this, but also vocational training, R&D policies. And then there is the workers element, and that's when we look at the functioning of the labor market, how to address segmentation, the duality of the labor market, how to design proper active labor market policies, and the issue of social benefits. And for each of these areas, we've tried to actually see what is the impact of the associated reform, not only on productivity growth and employment, but also on inequality. And here I've grouped them by the same label, so under firms, workers, and skills. And what you can see, and what I would like to highlight before going to specific example, is, for example, spurring productivity by easing barriers to firm entry and competition in product market. That supports GDP growth gains, and it doesn't seem to raise any trade-off between equity and efficiency objective, because the associated income gains are fairly shared across workers, and that reflects two mechanic movement at work. First one is higher labor productivity, which will obviously benefit the most affluent households, but also higher employment, which then will tend to benefit the lower skilled portion of the population. So here we have something that works more or less for all. When it comes to social protection and labor market reform, then we have a lot more trade-off between growth and the equity objective. Reduction, for example, in the generosity of unemployment benefit and social assistance will tend to leave the poor households behind, even if overall they generate employment gain. And if we want to meet the twin objectives of raising employment and mitigating the negative effect on poor households, we need to have in place some active labor market policy which are really targeted at employing the low-skilled workers or the long-term unemployed or the discouraging job seeker. And at the end, if I give you an example for skills, as I was mentioning earlier, early childcare education is a win-win across the board because it raises equality of opportunities, it makes people higher skilled later on, it allows women to work. So straight from the beginning and throughout the lifetime of generation, that's pushing up productivity and equality. Oops, sorry. So it's not because I'm French that we have the case for France, it's because that's the first one we have done and we have not expanded it yet. We are in the process of doing it for the G7, but I wanted to show you how this works in practice. So we do have some econometric equations which work, not perfectly all the time, but which I think are useful to actually rationalize and put in a framework the policy we want to look at. And what we did here, and which we have started generalizing for the G7, is to look at the reforms that the French president had put in place, implemented over the past couple of years, their impact on GDP growth, and their impact on the income revenue by quintile of the distribution. And I think it's quite interesting because overall what it shows is that by 5 years GDP growth should increase. That's what we expect and it's fine. But when we look at the distribution of income, we can see that it's especially focusing, it's especially boosting the middle income of the distribution. It's not bad because in any case in France inequalities are quite low, but when inequality is quite high to start with, I think there are two lessons from this. The first one is it tends naturally to increase inequality because it boosts the middle income earner revenues, but it usually left aside the lower part of the income distribution. And we have done that. We're in the process of completing this for the US and for Canada, and we observe the same thing, except the initial level of inequality is higher, so the distortion is also slightly higher. And as you can see from this example, we look at the labor market reforms, and for example, when we bring the bargaining and the unions closer to the firm level, then we usually have more productive firms, and we also have more employment because then the wages are more aligned with productivity growth. If we look at the product market reform, and here you have the reform of the railway system, so I understand it can seem a bit of a stretch to have the impact on income distribution, but it works fairly simply. It's just by opening to competition, you create more jobs. And because in France you have a relatively high minimum wage, even when these jobs are for the low-skilled people, they tend to increase their employment across the board. And we can do that obviously as well for the tax system. So what I wanted to show you in this part is how we operationalize the fact of looking at the impact of structural reforms on economic growth, but also on income distribution. The case of France was very specifically focused on few reforms, but what we are in the process of doing now is expanding it for these three categories that I mentioned before, looking at everything impacting firms' dynamics, everything that impacts workers' inclusion into the labor market, and the same for skills, and I come back to the last sentence. So first dynamic, we look at all the reforms that basically increase the diffusion of technologies across the board. What we were looking at the beginning is that digitalization and a certain monopoly power over data has created concentration in firms that is not allowing the diffusion of technology. You have firms coming in, growing and sizing up the opportunities, while the firms that exist are there, less productive, do not capture technology, but continue to survive. So that's one of the areas on which we focus, how to make new firms coming and also zombie firms leave the market, which will accelerate technology diffusion. There's also the resource management optimization, which is something that we work on. There's a lot of analysis in PISA and PIAC that shows that management is very unequal across countries, and that also tends to widen the gap between the productive firm and the others. So that's one area where we focus at the moment. For workers, we do deep dive into the question of duality and segmentation, including informality on the labor market. And believe me, it's not, and I think you alluded to this morning when you presented your paper, I think the labor market specificities and their impact on reform and income distribution is very intuitive, but it's very difficult to prove. So we do cross-country analysis using reforms, taking into account country-specific effect, but you are all very well placed to know that structural reforms do not happen every month. So the type of data that we have is very imperfect. And the work you've been doing in that respect is an impressive tribute to the type of analysis that we can do with rare reforms. So that's the other area. And the same thing when we look at how to achieve inclusion of female, foreign-born, and elderly. We know what are best practices, but quantifying them is difficult. The third thing is ensuring broad access to quality education and upskilling. I know it sounds obvious, but the fact is when we look across OECD countries, there's still a lot of member states which have little support for preschool, nursing, or early or kindergarten, or you will find very little support for people who leave their kids in school, but then they cannot, if the school is from 10 to 3 in the afternoon, then obviously the woman cannot work properly. So all these issues, we go into deep dive at the country level, but they will be more qualitative than quantitative. It's also about vocational training. One of the features for France, which you may have seen, is when we talk about increased expenditure of vocational training, you can see that it doesn't improve the employment and revenue of the poorest part of the population, but that's usually because vocational training in France is very targeted at the high-skilled people, which might sound absurd, but which you will find in a number of OECD countries, and explain why there's so much money on vocational training, which is not actually reaching through the lower skilled part of the population. And the last thing which I wanted to mention, and which comes across many analyses, is there's a lot which can be done to actually increase the revenue of the bottom, not 0 to 20%, but the 20 to 40% people, or 40 to 60% of the population. But when we look at the bottom 20%, it's difficult. Grading the skill is difficult, putting them at par with the rest of the population is difficult, and redistribution will always be needed. Now, the extent of redistribution that is desired by a society is a democratic choice, but I think it's important for us to point out to policymakers that you cannot lift properly the revenue of the poorest without redistribution, which is why I kept this for the last one. So what remains to be done, in our view, a lot. We focused on the relationship of reforms and income distribution because we believe, and our member states believe, that we need to actually enhance both productivity growth and reduce inequality. But as you can see, when we looked at the dashboard of indicators, there are still many areas for which we haven't got a substantive evidence of what's the right policy, and I will not stop, and what's the right policy to address this. And I've highlighted in red the topics where all research efforts are welcome. This is a call for support as well. One is promoting the lifelong learning and acquisition of skills. I think we need empirical evidence more than what we have. Sorry, the red part is what we have done work on. The darker one is the area for further research. It's very difficult, for example, to make a direct link between investing in communities' well-being and productivity growth. We start doing work on health, and we have produced some paper which shows that the level of pollution, as measured by a certain indicator, is actually directly related to lower productivity, but extending it to other work is difficult. Same with affordable housing. You mentioned that this morning. There's a huge horizontal housing project at the OECD to look at the impact on business cycle resilience, labor mobility, well-being, and some of them are sometimes offsetting each other. We need more work on how to promote regional catch-up. The truth, I think, is that the state of art in economics is lagging behind on what do you do with regions and remote areas. Do you connect them to business center? Do you recreate activities where they are? I don't think there's any strong evidence for this. And the last thing is, I would say, government governance and how this can be improved for inclusion and better policies, and on this as well. And this refers to the trust in government. We have a lot more work to do. So this is a list of paper on which we're working, but that's not what I was looking for. What I wanted to say in conclusion is we have the conviction, and there is, I think, sufficient evidence that the lack of inclusion and the lack of growth over the past 10, 20 years has actually spurred an appetite for policies that look at nationalism, protectionism, and less progressive policies. And for that reason, we now need to address, and we should have addressed before, inclusion as much as productivity issues. The evidence we have at this stage is, I think, limited, and we need a lot more research on this. But and the last point I would like to make is the evidence we have also is that for the poorest part of the population, redistribution will always be needed, and structural reforms will never be enough to make them catch up with the rest of the population. Thank you.
I have only one comment on one slide, and I'll make it short because lunch is waiting. You have a slide of the decline of redistribution, and you mentioned that explanation is a change in the structure of whatever. But I have a research done pretty recently with Michele Battisti, I'll be happy to update you later, that shows that redistribution, the main factor that affects it, is the size of government, which means public expenditures as share of GDP. It's strong, it's effective, it really dwarfs all the other variables, and that is the main explanation for that, because the shrinking of governments throughout the OECD countries is the reason for the decline in redistribution. We also use instrumental variables, I'll tell you about it.
So I won't comment on the use of instrumental variables. I'm sure you do use them. I think I agree with you, but it's to a large extent, but there are also two things. One is a decline in tax receipt, which obviously is triggering in turn a decline in expenditures. And then there's some countries, the one which have the largest share of public expenditure, which are at the center, have seen less redistribution, which goes into the direction. And yes, I would be happy to read your paper.
So it's nice to have a lecture by a person from the club of the rich countries about inclusion. That's good. One key factor that is completely missing is the immigration, which basically depresses wages, disposable income, create more fiscal burden, so the voters will diminish the generosity of the welfare state and redistribution. And countries are different in terms of the assimilation of immigrants. Maybe Israel is an outlier in this regard, but as far as maybe the European countries, this is really a key issue, immigration and assimilation of immigrants.
So, first, I wasn't intending to lecture, but provide some evidence on some facts and how we address them. Second, the Club of Rich Countries, that's not totally true, because we have countries like Mexico, we have countries like Indonesia, and I'm happy that Israel is also part of it. But third, on migration, I think it's an example of where one needs to look at the entire package. Because if you take countries which have high minimum wage and bargaining position, then the migrants come in and they are paid the same wages as the others. Therefore, the choice will be made on their skills and capacity. It's also, I think, one of the indicators that we have in the dashboard, if you look at it here, where we look at the foreign-born unemployment gap, and it's also some work that we are doing. But I think it's a very good example of why we cannot look at one thing in isolation, but we need to look at it within the context of the entire countries. But thanks for pointing out the issue.